Have you ever heard of Emmeline Pankhurst? She was the figurehead of women's suffrage in England during the early 20th century. Though she's been arrested over a dozen times for her organization's militant tactics, her actions led directly to women being granted the equal voting opportunities as the men in England.
Emmeline Pankhurst was born in Manchester on July 15, 1858, and then moved to Paris to attend l'École Normale Supérieure to secure her secondary education. She got married in 1878 to the politically influential Richard Pankhurst, who supported and helped her with her work with women's suffrage. During her life, Emmeline Pankhurst founded many societies, one of the most notable being the Women's Franchise League, which was founded in 1898. However, Emmeline Pankhurst felt the actions of this group were not radical enough to encourage real change in the government. This led to her founding the Women's Social and Political Union. Most of the work Emmeline did with the women's suffrage movement in England had to do with this group. Pankhurst gave many speeches during her life, one of the most notable being the Freedom or Death speech she gave in Hartford, Connecticut in 1913. This speech focused highly on how the government viewed women and how that related to the women's lack of the same democratic freedoms of men in England. Pankhurst emphasized that the men of the British government did not view women as real, equal human beings, as they were unable to have a say in how their government worked. She stated that if women lacked any authority in the government, the only way to delegate real change would be to revert back to the tried and true methods of physical revolution. This quote demonstrates a main point of her speech, and it reads, "I dare say, in the minds of many of you, you will perhaps forgive me for this personal touch, that I do not look either very like a soldier or very like a convict, and yet I am both." Now, a main point in this speech was the way that women are perceived, and that she's working tirelessly to change that. You can see this in this quote. And she labels herself as a soldier and a convict, which demonstrates clearly why I have decided to label her as an outlaw. The Women's Social and Political Union's motto was deeds, not words. This is clearly shown in the actions of the suffragettes, which was the name of the women in this society. The suffragettes would often assault and fight police officers when promoting their ideals for women's suffrage. This is a quote from one of Emmeline Pankhurst's trials after being arrested yet again. "We are here not because we are lawbreakers, we are here in our efforts to become lawmakers." This quote demonstrates Pankhurst's ideals and sums up the beliefs of the Women's Social and Political Union of which she was in charge of. After fighting with the police, the women in the Women's Social and Political Union would often be jailed. In retaliation to these jailings, the women began a hunger strike while in prison. And in response to these hunger strikes, the prison guards and officials began to attempt to force feed the prisoners in gruesome ways, as shown in these infographics. These infographics were made by the members of the Women's Social and Political Union, and they garnered lots of public support for their cause and increased anti-government feelings among the public in England. These actions by the suffragettes led to the government instituting a Cat and Mouse Act, which allowed prisoners who were extremely malnourished to leave jail and return once they regained their health. This only helped the suffragettes' cause, as they would continue their rallying when they were let out of prison, then they would be jailed again, would hunger strike again, and then would be released because of their malnutrition. This continued on for many months, and through this cycle, it's clear to see that by labeling these women as outlaws and treating them in poor ways, the government actually helped the members of the Women's Social and Political Union's ability to garner increasing public support for their cause. This slide is showing women working during wartime. This is shown that when World War I began, all of the Women's Social and Political Union prisoners were released, and the goal of Pankhurst doing this was to show that the government that women had just as much capability as men as they took over many of their jobs. During her life, Emmeline Pankhurst succeeded in having many acts passed and consistently worked towards the goal of women having equal rights to men. Her husband, as shown here, Richard Pankhurst, was an advocate for women's suffrage, and with the help of Emmeline, worked to pass the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, which allowed women to keep property and earnings before and after marriage. Then, in 1918, the Representation of the People Act was passed. This gave women over the age of 30 who owned property the right to vote. Emmeline Pankhurst's lasting impacts are clear to see, and she is even immortalized as a statue in St. Peter's Square in Manchester. Unbeknownst to her, she succeeded in her life's goal of getting women the same voting rights as men. The Representation of the People Act was expanded weeks after Emmeline's death in 1928 to include all women over 21 to vote equally with men. Though it's sad that she was unable to see her life's work come to fruition, The lasting effect she had on Great Britain's efforts in reaching equality is truly astounding. And this is my works cited.